Elon Musk thought he was fighting a lawsuit until Karoline Leavitt uncovered the truth, a bribed judge, a rigged trial, and a scandal that shook the legal system. It started as just another day in court, the kind where suits fill the benches, lawyers whisper in hushed tones, and a judge presides with an air of authority that commands the room. But something was off. Elon Musk sat at the defendant's table, his fingers drumming idly against the polished wood. The case against him wasn't just another lawsuit, it was a high-stakes corporate war disguised as a legal battle. His opponents, a powerful group of investors with deep political ties, were accusing him of fraudulent business practices. It was absurd. The allegations were flimsy at best, but Musk had seen enough of the world to know that logic didn't always win in a courtroom. He glanced at his lead attorney, Russell Greer, a no-nonsense trial lawyer with a reputation for dismantling weak cases. Greer was confident, at least at first. But then came the first red flag. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is making baseless claims with no supporting evidence." Judge Bernard Langford barely looked up. "Overruled." Greer hesitated for half a second, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. The prosecution had just introduced an argument that had zero legal standing. But the judge let it slide like it was routine. Musk leaned in. "That's a stretch, don't you think?" he murmured. Greer didn't answer. He was too busy trying to figure out what had just happened. Then another blow. "Your Honor, we request permission to introduce key documents outlining the inconsistencies in the plaintiff's claims." Judge Langford sighed, rubbing his temple like he was dealing with a minor inconvenience. "Denied." Greer straightened his tie, a subtle but telling gesture. Musk wasn't the only one noticing the pattern. Every ruling so far had gone against them. Every single one. The prosecution's case, which should have been riddled with holes, suddenly seemed airtight. Not because it was strong, but because they were being allowed to say whatever they wanted. It was like the judge had already made up his mind. Musk crossed his arms, scanning the judge's expression. Langford was composed. Neutral. Too neutral. He wasn't reacting, wasn't engaging, wasn't even pretending to be interested in fairness. The next few hours only made things worse. Whenever Greer tried to push back, Langford shut him down. Whenever the prosecution introduced shaky evidence, it was accepted without question. Witnesses favorable to Musk were dismissed as irrelevant. These weren't just bad rulings, they were deliberate. By midday recess, the tension in the air was thick. Musk and Greer sat in a quiet corner of the courthouse cafeteria, neither touching their food. "This isn't just bias," Greer said finally, his voice low. "This is something else." Musk already knew. He had dealt with competitors willing to play dirty before. But this was something bigger. Someone wanted him to lose. Badly. The problem was, he had no proof. For now. But someone else was already digging for it. Karoline Leavitt wasn't the kind of journalist who took things at face value. She built her career on exposing power plays, corporate corruption, and backdoor deals that never made it to the front pages. And something about Musk's case felt off. She had been watching the trial from the beginning, tuning in like everyone else. But the more she listened, the less sense it made. Musk's legal team was airtight. His attorneys weren't the kind to miss details. Yet every time they made a move, it got shut down before it could gain traction. That wasn't just bad lawyering. That was interference. She dug in. Leavitt started with Judge Bernard Langford. On paper, his record was clean. Too clean. A well-respected federal judge with no history of controversy. No past rulings that hinted at bias. He was the kind of official people assumed was beyond reproach. But in her experience, squeaky clean records usually meant someone had scrubbed them. She pulled financial records, campaign donations, any connection to high-profile corporate figures. At first, nothing stood out. But then she found it. A trust fund buried beneath layers of legal jargon. One of Langford's family trusts had received a series of anonymous deposits over the past 2 years. The money came in irregular waves, hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time, routed through offshore accounts that didn't lead back to any one person. That alone wasn't damning. Wealthy families had complicated finances. But the timing, that was the problem. One of the first major deposits landed weeks before Langford was assigned to Musk's case. Leavitt's gut tightened. That wasn't a coincidence. She expanded her search, tracing who stood to gain from Musk's downfall. The prosecution's lead attorney, Daniel Forsyth, had an interesting connection. He had worked as legal counsel for multiple energy companies, all of which had lobbied aggressively against Musk's ventures in solar energy and electric vehicles. It was all coming together. Someone wanted Musk out of the picture. Someone powerful. But suspicions weren't proof. She needed something concrete, emails, recorded conversations, anything that couldn't be ignored. That's when she got a tip. A former legal clerk who had worked in Langford's office for 2 years reached out under an encrypted email. The message was short: "You're looking in the right place. Langford doesn't make big rulings without outside approval. If you want the real story, check his travel records. Mexico, late 2023. He wasn't there for vacation." Leavitt's fingers flew across the keyboard. She ran Langford's official travel logs and cross-checked them against private jet charters from corporate accounts. And there it was. Late 2020, a 3-day trip to Cancun. The same weekend that high-profile executives from Tesla's biggest competitors attended a private business retreat. Langford wasn't just there. He had been flown in on their dime. Her pulse pounded. This was it. Langford wasn't just biased. He was bought. But exposing it would require more than just documents. It needed to go public in a way no one could ignore. Leavitt didn't waste time. The pieces were all there: financial trails, anonymous deposits, off-the-books meetings with executives who stood to gain from Musk's downfall. But in today's world, evidence wasn't enough. It had to hit hard. It had to be undeniable. She reached out to a trusted source in cybersecurity, Ethan Vaughn, a former DOJ analyst turned whistleblower. If anyone could find the missing link, it was him. "I need access to any encrypted communications linked to Langford. If he's covering his tracks, he's not doing it alone," she said over a burner call. Ethan hesitated. "This isn't just a bad ruling, Karoline. If Langford's involved in something deeper, you're stepping into dangerous territory." She exhaled sharply. "I don't care. Just tell me if you can get something." A long pause. Then, "Give me 24 hours. She barely had 12. The trial was moving at breakneck speed, and if Musk's team didn't have something soon, he was going down. Then, the next morning, her phone lit up. "Ethan Vaughn. Check your email. It's worse than you think." Leavitt opened the file. Inside was a set of leaked emails between Judge Langford and a corporate lobbyist named Philip Grayson, a man with direct ties to the prosecution's lead attorney, Daniel Forsyth. The emails weren't vague. They were direct. One message stood out. "The deal is simple. Ensure the rulings favor Forsyth's clients, and you won't have to worry about retirement. The fund will take care of itself. Just make sure Musk's people don't get a single win in that courtroom." Leavitt's stomach dropped. It was bribery. Plain and simple. And worse, Langford responded. "Understood. As long as everything stays off the books, we won't have an issue." This wasn't just a bad judge. This was a judge on payroll. She wasted no time. Within 3 hours, Leavitt went live on national television. "This isn't just courtroom bias," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "This is corruption at the highest level. We have proof that Judge Bernard Langford accepted financial incentives to manipulate the case against Elon Musk. And here's the worst part, he did it in coordination with the prosecution's legal team." She shared screenshots of the emails. She read excerpts on air. She outlined the offshore payments, the Mexico retreat, the corporate ties. It was explosive. Social media erupted. Within minutes, Judge Langford's scandal was trending. People demanded an investigation. Politicians weighed in. Even those who weren't fans of Musk couldn't ignore it. But back in the courtroom, Musk's legal team was still in the dark. They didn't know the bomb had just dropped. But they were about to find out. And when they did, everything changed. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Langford sat in his high-back chair, looking composed. But Musk noticed the small things, the way his fingers gripped the gavel just a little too tightly. The way he cleared his throat before speaking, like he was stalling. Something was off. Russell Greer, Musk's attorney, wasn't paying attention to the judge. He was focused on his phone, scanning the screen as if he had just been handed a loaded weapon. Then he turned to Musk, voice low. "Have you seen the news?" Musk frowned. No wishing. Greer slid his phone across the table. Musk's eyes moved over the headline. Breaking. Judge Bernard Langford caught in bribery scandal. Emails, offshore payments exposed. For the first time since the trial started, Musk let out a quiet laugh. Langford had no idea. "Your Honor," Greer said, standing abruptly. "Before we proceed, I'd like to submit urgent new evidence into the record." Langford barely looked up. "Denied." Greer didn't flinch. "The evidence is regarding your financial ties to the prosecution's backers." "Are you denying a motion to introduce evidence against yourself?" A ripple went through the courtroom. The prosecution's lead attorney, Forsyth, shifted in his seat, his face suddenly pale. Langford's expression hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Greer smiled, the kind of smile that says you know you've won. "Then you won't mind us reading a few of your emails out loud." The courtroom erupted. The judge slammed his gavel. "Silence. I will not tolerate." Greer kept talking. "We have correspondence between you and Philip Grayson discussing a coordinated effort to ensure that Elon Musk's legal defense was obstructed at every turn. We have proof of offshore payments. A weekend retreat where you were personally flown out to meet corporate executives who stand to gain from Musk's downfall." Langford's hand trembled as he adjusted his glasses. "This is absurd," he said, voice quieter now. Greer wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out printed copies of the leaked emails, and handed them to the court clerk. "We'll let the record decide what's absurd." Murmurs swallowed the room. Musk leaned back in his chair, watching as the judge's neutral facade crumbled. And then, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. A woman in a navy blazer strode in, her presence commanding. The room fell silent. It was a federal investigator. The judge looked at her like he had just seen a ghost. "Judge Langford," she said, voice even. "We need to speak with you immediately." Langford's mouth opened, then shut. For the first time since the trial started, he was the one who had run out of moves. But the fallout had only just begun. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Bernard Langford sat still, his hand tightening around the gavel. But for the first time since the trial began, he looked lost. His jaw clenched. His face drained of color. He wasn't just facing an uncomfortable moment. He was staring at the rapid, uncontrollable collapse of everything he had built. The federal investigator didn't move from her spot. Didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The weight of her words had already taken the air out of the room. "Judge Langford," she repeated, her voice even but unforgiving. "Step down from the bench. As of this moment, you are under federal investigation for judicial misconduct, bribery, and obstruction of justice." A wave of sharp whispers broke out in the gallery. The sound of shuffled papers. Of people shifting in their seats. Of attorneys leaning toward each other, murmuring. No one ever saw something like this happen in real time. Langford inhaled deeply, but his breath was unsteady. He straightened his back and forced a scowl. "This is highly irregular," he said, voice low but laced with panic. I am still presiding over an active case. The investigator tilted her head slightly, unimpressed. Not anymore. Silence. Langford knew it. Forsyth knew it. Everyone in that courtroom knew it. It was over. Musk leaned back, folding his arms. He didn't smile, he wasn't that kind of person. But the satisfaction in his eyes was impossible to miss. The game had played out. And the side that thought it controlled the board had just been checkmated. Forsyth, the prosecution's lead attorney, suddenly jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. There is no reason to believe. The investigator turned her gaze toward him, flipping open a small notepad. Mr. Forsyth, your name has come up in connection with this case as well. His mouth snapped shut. We'll be speaking with you next, she added. The color drained from Forsyth's face. Langford still hadn't moved. His fingers hovered near the gavel, but he didn't touch it. He couldn't. The legal consequences were one thing. But the public exposure? That was career-ending. A story like this wouldn't stay contained to legal circles. It would explode across every news outlet in the country. He darted a glance toward the gallery, toward the rows of spectators, journalists, analysts, citizens who had come to watch a simple corporate dispute unfold. Some of them had their phones raised, recording. This wasn't a private scandal anymore. It was playing out live. Langford turned to the court bailiff, as if silently asking for help, for an escape route. But the bailiff just stood there. He wasn't about to get in the middle of this. No one was. The investigator stepped closer to the bench and placed a small folder in front of him. If you choose to resist, you're only making this worse for yourself. The investigation is already underway. This is happening with or without your cooperation. Langford clenched his jaw. His hands trembled for a fraction of a second before he quickly withdrew them. Then something changed. The fight left his eyes. He exhaled sharply, looked toward Forsyth, who looked just as helpless as he did, and then turned his gaze downward, staring at the desk in front of him. He had two choices. Neither were good. Finally, he reached for his gavel. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the handle like he didn't want to touch it. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "This court is now in recess." He didn't bang the gavel. He didn't look at anyone. He just stood up and walked out. As he disappeared through the judge's chamber doors, the entire courtroom erupted into chaos. But the fallout was just beginning. The moment the judge disappeared behind the heavy chamber doors, the courtroom exploded. Attorneys whispered frantically. Spectators stood, phones raised, capturing every second. Some shouted questions. Is the case dismissed? What happens next? But there were no answers. Even the court officers seemed uncertain of what to do. Russell Greer exhaled sharply, turning to Musk. We just witnessed a sitting judge abandon his own bench in the middle of a trial. Musk raised an eyebrow. Yeah, that doesn't happen often. But Forsyth, the prosecution's lead attorney, wasn't about to let things slip away that easily. He slammed his hands on his table, standing so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. This changes nothing, he barked, his voice cracking with desperation. This trial is still active. The prosecution, Greer interrupted smoothly, was built on fraud. He gestured toward the court clerk. This entire case was manipulated from day one. And now that the judge pulling the strings is gone, you're just a man standing in the rubble of your own lies. Musk almost smiled. Forsyth's jaw twitched. His face was red, beads of sweat forming at his temple. He looked like he wanted to scream, but he had nowhere to direct his anger. The entire courtroom was against him now. Then, before he could say another word, the court bailiff stepped forward. Mr. Forsyth, he said, voice firm, you're being asked to remain in the courthouse for questioning. Forsyth's mouth snapped shut. In that moment, he knew it was over. Musk turned back to Greer. So what happens next? Greer exhaled through his nose. A mess. That was an understatement. Within 24 hours, Judge Langford's name was plastered across every major news outlet in the country. The headlines were brutal. Judge caught in bribery scandal. Corporate ties unraveled. FBI opens investigation in the Musk trial corruption. Judicial system in crisis, who else is compromised? Langford didn't speak to the press. He had gone dark, reportedly seeking legal counsel of his own. Forsyth, on the other hand, tried to save himself, issuing a statement insisting that he had no direct involvement in the bribery scheme. No one bought it. Because then, another bombshell dropped. Karoline Leavitt, who had set this entire collapse in motion, published another report. This time, it wasn't just about Langford. It was about an entire network of judicial and corporate corruption. Langford wasn't the only judge on the payroll. There were others. Forsyth wasn't just a lawyer, he was a fixer, a key player in ensuring certain verdicts went a specific way. The system wasn't just flawed. It had been rigged for years. Public outrage was immediate. Protests erupted. Politicians were forced to take a stance. The Department of Justice announced a full-scale investigation into judicial corruption, one of the largest in modern history. And Musk? Musk walked away from the case completely free. The lawsuit collapsed along with any credibility his accusers had. His reputation, already built on defying powerful interests, only grew stronger. A week later, in a rare moment, he publicly thanked Leavitt for exposing what no one else could. "This wasn't just about me," he said in an interview. "This was about something bigger. The people who rig the system assume no one will ever fight back." Karoline proved them wrong. And that was the lesson in all of this. Corruption thrives in the dark. It depends on silence, on fear, on people looking the other way. But when you shine a light on it, when you refuse to back down, it crumbles. The truth isn't always convenient. It's not always easy. But it's always worth fighting for. And that's exactly what they did. If you believe in exposing the truth, in holding power accountable, don't just watch. Speak up. Share the story. Subscribe for more. And never stop asking questions. Because the more we look, the more we find. And the truth always matters.